I do find it ironic here. I have had this theory on this election that it's going to be 2016 in reverse, meaning in 2016, you had a whole bunch of voters that just decided, you know what, I don't want her as president. I'm not crazy about this guy, but at least it's different. Let's try it. And I think and that's why, I've always been I think there was some polling error, but I think a lot of this was a whole bunch. I think the late decider it almost uniformly went Trump. And remember how that campaign closed, James. Donald Trump spent his final days in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Hillary Clinton was spending money in Texas, Arizona, Florida. She was looking for the 400 electoral vote victory. Sound familiar with what you just described? Where's Kamala Harris this week? Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Donald Trump's done Madison Square Garden. He's going to campaign in New Mexico. He's going to have a rally in Virginia. New Mexico and Virginia are competitive, but not close. There's a difference, meaning that they're single-digit states. Look, just like with Hillary Clinton with Texas, if she's winning Texas, it's over. Sure. If he's winning New Mexico, Virginia, sure. But he's also winning everything else. There is a part of me that thinks that the voter this time says, I've seen that presidency. I haven't seen that one. And that Harris could benefit from the very same thing Trump benefited from in 2016, when you had candidates who weren't comfortable with either candidate. They're going to pick new over same. And Trump's not new anymore. And that's why he's been trying to close against Biden, really tie Harris to Biden. If you're thinking about Joe Biden going into that polling booth, that's bad news for Kamala Harris. But if you're thinking about Donald Trump going into that voting booth, then suddenly Kamala Harris looks like change. So I do question these. Put it this way. If he loses, this is how Republicans will criticize the Trump campaign, saying they had a terrible close. He had a great close in 2016. A terrific close in 2016. He was a bit more disciplined. That's when he pulled back on the birtherism. Remember, he was really trying to normalize himself. Dare I say he was trying to win. Right now, it doesn't feel like a guy trying to win. It feels like the guy trying to prove a point. And it's too close of election. I think it's unless they see something we don't. And I would say this: the way Trump's been behaving, to me, I think you can see they're nervous. Well, now you have singled out what will be the great criticism of her if she loses. And I've been hearing this criticism. There's a lot of Democrats that think she would be better off spending her time in Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Charlotte, turning out voters that if they show up are going to be her voters, people of color, urban voters, etc. But their theory of the case is they don't win unless they get this Nikki Haley crossover voter. And you're not going to get the Nikki Haley voter on substance. They don't like the Democratic economic policies. They want tougher border security. So but the one thing where you see some agreement on is Trump really doesn't fully follow the Constitution. This is troubling. So it's their theory of the case. Ironically, and I think this is worth noting, how Harris is closing is much different than how every House and Senate Democrat is closing. They're all closing on abortion rights, actually Social Security, protecting that, worrying about abortion rights. In some cases, a defensive ad or two on the border. They're not touching January 6th. They're not touching the democracy issue. They're focused more on those three more substantive issues. Now, I might argue a down ballot candidate is more likely to do that anyway, regardless of what the issue environment is. But it is notable to me that all Democrats are closing in one direction. Kamala Harris is closing in another. But I do think it's her path to victory. And I think that's what they've determined. It's a choice. She had 108 days. This is the problem, right? She couldn't do everything, and this was the choice they made. We'll see. I mean, you're not alone. There is a ton of Democratic skepticism among Democrats who are not involved in Harris's campaign about this closing decision. But look, she got 75,000 people to show up for her closing speech on the ellipse. Can't, that's not chump change. I can't imagine a James Comey moment. But it's possible that Madison Square Garden is the Comey moment, for what it's worth. That was suddenly, because it does feel like there was a momentum shift that had some legs. Donald Trump rarely apologizes. He tried to distance himself for 48 hours on that one. It left a mark.
This is the comments about Puerto Rico.
The comments about Puerto Rico, it left a mark, especially with the Donald Trump, who really has been having some success courting working class voters of all stripes. And he really, that's another way we could see polling error. The polls have indicated that Trump's going to do better with men of color than anybody since George W. Bush on the Republican side. But the polling also indicates that Kamala Harris is going to do better with married white women than any Democrat's ever done. Well, what if those two voting groups go back to how they vote? Or what if only one of them goes back to how they normally vote, but the other group sticks, right? That's all of a sudden how one of them gets a 4-point lead and wins this in an electoral sweep. And look, I don't want to rule anything out, right? So she can lose both Pennsylvania and North Carolina. But if she somehow won Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, she'd get there, right? And, you can't say it's something that can happen since Joe Biden just won all three of those states, right? But realistically, it's hard to imagine that the winner of this presidential campaign doesn't win Pennsylvania. And I think that's probably it explained to me how somebody, the last person to win Pennsylvania and lose the presidency was John Kerry. So that it's not like it's an unrealistic scenario. But it doesn't happen often. I don't think Pennsylvania is ever going to change, though. It's always sort of been there, and there's just a geographic reason for it, right? The eastern part of Pennsylvania is part of the New York City, feels like part of the New York City corridor, right? The New York-Washington corridor.
Yeah.
And Pittsburgh is the gateway to the Midwest and the heartland. And Pennsylvania is literally the crossroads between East Coast America and Midwest America. I think it's inevitable it will always sort of be sitting in this 52-48, world, no more than that. Like those are your floors and ceilings. Like the worst day for either party is something like that. And it just where it sits geographically, right? It's the gateway to the Midwest, and at the same time, its eastern part. This is going to be one of the more fun things. There's a county in northeast Pennsylvania that used to be Republican leaning that may go blue this time. And you know why? It's a bunch of COVID refugees. People that lived and worked in New York City and decided they wanted to live in a more open space. They moved to Pennsylvania. It is commutable. Okay. Yeah. This is not an uncommutable place, but they don't have to commute every day, right? Maybe they only have to go in 2 or 3 days a week. Well, there's suddenly a whole bunch of new voters that weren't there in 2020 that now are registered voters in that county. And there's a few places like that. Michigan has some ex-Chicago people that have done that, which also could end up adding Democrats to the total. So there's then again, Florida's more out of reach because of COVID refugees moving down there that were Republican leaning in some blue states. So I do think we're going to see some slight shifts in our map that have been due to COVID migration. I think Shapiro would have been a better virtue signal to the middle. But we're talking, I do think it's on the margins. And look, a lot of bad running mates have gotten elected vice president because people don't care about the running mate, right? I don't think Vance has been helpful to Trump at all, but Trump could still win despite him. And I think I'll give this. I think Walz served a purpose early he made a good first impression. He's likable, right? People like him. But he didn't bring a constituency. And that was a concern. Like it's not exactly a conservative Democrat, right? He's really more of a mainstream liberal Democrat, which, that is what it is. So, we'll see. But look, he's not a drag, and it's possible Vance has caused Trump even more problems with women. Well, look, I have a simpler way to do it because North Carolina and Pennsylvania, we should know the results of both states by sunrise Wednesday morning on the East Coast here of the United States. And we just think Pennsylvania should be counting their mail-in ballots faster and all this stuff. We think they'll be at 95 to 98% of votes counted sometime between 3 and 6 a.m. North Carolina has always traditionally counted their vote pretty efficiently and pretty quickly. So if the same candidate wins both states, while we may not officially have somebody over 270, you'll have an idea. So that to me, that's one way. I mean, I'm going to learn a lot in North Carolina. There's a couple of early House races that I'm looking at as sort of canaries in the coal mine. There's one in Virginia, which is an early counting state. There's a congressional race there that is a Republican-leaning district. But if Democrats have flipped it, that tells you something about Democratic turnout in general and about Republican turnout in general, right? Type of thing. So that is a canary in the coal mine. But just to keep you, if we don't know, if those two states are split, right? One candidate wins one, then everything's going to get litigated ballot by ballot. And I'll give you a scenario that I talked about on my last podcast, which I'm guessing you already know, which is if Harris wins North Carolina and Trump wins Pennsylvania, the entire political world is going to be litigating every ballot we count in the state of Nevada, because Nevada is she'll be 3 electoral votes short, assuming she wins Wisconsin and Michigan. She's going to need either Arizona or Nevada. There's a lot of skepticism that Arizona is going to come in for her. Trump has looked stronger there. I think Nevada is going to be the closest state. I think it's going to be in raw vote. I mean, percentages, since it's a small state, it could. But I think we're talking less than 5,000 votes. Right? I think it's going to be that. Well, now, 5,000 votes would actually be a landslide compared to the Florida recount back in 2000 at 537. But that is a scenario that keeps us in for a week at a minimum. And frankly, where people are litigating, because Nevada allows your ballots to come in later. And if it's rejected, if your ballot gets rejected, you actually get a couple of days to fix it. Maybe you didn't put your name on it right. Maybe you didn't sign it and got it rejected. Can you imagine the fights between the lawyers going, no, that ballot isn't, you can't go get that ballot fixed. And no, we're going to call the voter does get 24 hours to come in and claim that, it will be a nightmare. Now, of course, the other nightmare scenario is what if we have 3 states that are decided by 5,000 votes or less? Right, all at the same time. Right, the nightmare scenario is not one state that's holding us up, but 3. That's the nightmare.
Well, on that cheery note, on Halloween, Chuck, this has been an absolute
pleasure.
Spooking
you out, right, my friend?
Thank you so much for joining us again on Times Radio.